Right.
Well, welcome everyone. This is Will Costanzo. I'm just here by voice, like her in the movie. And it is really my pleasure to welcome Austin and Iain. At this point in our series, we began last August, some of you may remember, with Deborah Shaw's historical survey of the Transnational in film studies since 2005, I think it was, including the founding of the Transnational Cinemas Journal in 2010. And now we're coming full circle because Austin and Iain are the founding brethren of our organization. When was it? 2013, I think, 7 years ago. And they served as our first co-chairs and really got this thing going. So it is a pleasure to have you guys back and hear what you've been doing since then and what you see happening for the SIG that you founded.
Thanks, Will. Shall I begin?
Please.
Yeah. Hi everyone. And Iain and I have been discussing how we should present this, and we're not going to present slides or clips. We're just going to talk until we deem that we've had enough of talking, and then we'll hand over to you. So I think the way we're just going to start this is to think about why we founded the SIG in the first place. And we have to go back to the Boston conference, Boston SCMS in 2012 for that. And that was my first SCMS. I don't think it wasn't yours, was it, Iain? You'd been to a couple before that, I think.
Yeah, I'd been to a couple, but I'd had the problem that loads of people have with their first SCMS, where you don't really know anyone and there's far too many people and there's not really opportunities to meet. Like, you go to a panel, but there's 25 other panels going at the same time. So I definitely had that experience of SCMS. Yeah.
So I think, like, definitely my memory of Boston 2012 was exactly as Iain just said, like, far too many panels, far too many people milling around, and then the Brits kind of tended to mill together. So we'd, as usual, flown across the Atlantic just to talk to each other, which we could have done at home, which is often what happens at SCMS. But and so we went to all the meetings and panels, and we went to various things. And I remember going to some panels on Italian cinema, which is the thing I've studied, and I remember going to some panels on French cinema and seeing just various area studies disciplines, and they all seem to be saying really similar things. They were all obsessed at the time with the definitions of the national, the limitations of the national as a reference point. But I didn't see the same people in any two panels. It was just me panel surfing, and they didn't seem to be aware that they were talking about the same methodologies and the same problems. And so I remember going to the SIG, there was a kind of orientation event for new members in 2012, and where all the SIG chairs stood up and said what their SIGs did. And so I remember thinking, this is a good opportunity to meet new people and to form networks. But there were only 10 scholarly interest groups at the time, which seems kind of quaint and old world now, because there are something like 40, I think, now, and it's just grown massively over the last few years. But there are very few. And I just remember thinking, none of these really, I can't see a way into any of these. None of them seem to directly pertain to what I research and what I do. So I got talking to Christine Holmland, who was president of SCMS at the time, and she, in her inimitable manner, she just put her arm around me and said, "Well, found one then." And so Iain and I got our heads together, and that's what we did. I'll pass over to Iain now, who can probably elaborate a bit.
Yeah. So it was definitely, it was Austin's idea to set up the SIG, I think kind of inspired by that experience at SCMS. I guess he got me on board because I had lots of Facebook friends with people who we might be able to get on board on the SIG. So, like, if you're trying to kind of get the signatures, like just on a logistical level, you need a certain number of signatures to get it through the board. It's like, okay, well, Iain knows a fair amount of people, at least through Facebook, so okay, that'll be a quick way of kind of bringing in lots of people that we can kind of sign the form and say, yeah, we need a transnational cinema SIG. But yeah, I think for me as well, one of the big parts of the reason for doing this was that the transnational was this term that was being used in panels all through the SCMS conferences that we've been to, but tends to be used, like, people would get bogged down in debates over definition, and you would go to a series of panels about transnational cinema, and it would be a different set of people, because it would be, okay, here's French cinema and the transnational, and here's a panel on Japanese cinema and the transnational, and here's a panel on Indian cinema and the transnational. And because each of the scholars are specialists within that national cinema tradition, they're not going to the other panels that are largely dealing with those kind of same issues about the relationship between the national and the transnational, and how we study that, how we grapple with it. So yeah, we felt like, yeah, building a kind of transnational SIG might just create a kind of meeting point, a place where we can kind of build networks, build connections, and have these discussions. So yeah, I think, yeah, the first thing is that we kind of brought everyone together and kind of got the SIG set up. And then it was thinking about what we actually do at the conferences. And so a big thing for us was always the kind of the meetings, the annual kind of meetings, that we wanted to be largely about a social event where you can bring together scholars to meet each other and speak to each other. I mean, one of the things I remember from those kind of SIG events that we set up was we would always go around the room and everyone would introduce themselves and what they're working on right now. And that would be new kind of graduate students, it would be established professors, just everyone go around the room and say what it is you're doing. And that just helps build those connections so that people can say, oh yeah, I've read your work, or I'm also working on this aspect, or yeah, have you thought about this? And it's about building those networks and creating those connections. I mean, I also remember that some established professors weren't that into the idea of a kind of going around the room saying who you are. Sometimes they would kind of sneakily sneak out with their glass of wine at that point, so they didn't need to be part of it. But I think overall, the kind of the benefit of it outweighed any kind of awkwardness of that kind of student seminar thing of let's all go around the room and say your favorite film. But yeah, okay, back to Austin.
Yeah, so I think and I think the mention of wine there is kind of quite important, actually. It sounds like a kind of just a conference anecdote, but I think the way we always tried to make the meetings so that they were kind of milling around with a bit of alcohol, just talking to people, and people who you might not necessarily have talked to otherwise, and then having that kind of more formal guard down part of the event. And actually that worked really well, because people were just willing to say, I do this, I specialize in this area of area studies, and it did tend to be area studies scholars. And then they would start mixing, and people who didn't know each other previously, and then we'd go away for a social to a bar and like nearby the hotel or something, or in the hotel bar. And so it did just become like, it really was just a social thing, really. I think, like, I don't think we particularly added much in a scholarly sense to it. It was really just creating a forum where people could get together, and then just stepping back and allowing it to happen. And I think that's what occurred to me. The whole value of a SIG is really that it's not about who the chairs are, so much as the fact that it happens and the fact that it allows links to be drawn. But then when we did put on workshops, and it was workshops in particular, which is now a kind of defunct SCMS format, which is a shame, because I think it's because you're only allowed to do one session. People understandably have to do panels because they need to get their research out there. So, but when we did these workshops, they were very productive. And I think in the first year, we're not going to go through this article in tiny details, but in the first year, one of the things that was really interesting was how people were coming up to us and saying, I do this thing, I'm interested in this area, is it relevant to your SIG? And I don't think we said no to a single person. And so it began to occur to us that this is a huge area. We thought it might be a ghetto. We thought it might be a methodological sort of building new walls around a new discipline, whereas actually it was a bridge, and it was just so huge that it was almost too big. And so then we begun to try to think beyond definition of what we mean by the word transnational, because that had been done to death by that time, I think.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, the workshops were often the most kind of productive part. Like there was the workshop on teaching transnational cinema. There was lots of workshops on kind of how we approach the transnational as researchers, and there were, you know, obviously, you know, debates over definition. But yeah, like with the teaching one, it's, you know, we're grappling with all of those issues of how do you teach a module on transnational cinema, and it raised so many of the issues that we have as scholars anyway. Like it's the problem of kind of language competence, of kind of cultural knowledge and skills. Like it's difficult to get beyond, like if you're teaching a module on transnational cinema, then by definition, a lot of the time, you're going to be asking your students to not only have knowledge of Hong Kong cinema, but also have knowledge of Japanese cinema and also world cinema from all around the world and the interconnections between them. And whereas on a kind of world cinema module, you could kind of do like, okay, here's the introduction to the history and culture of this cinema. Here's an example of a film. Transnational would always throw up all of those extra problems involved in kind of moving away from a focus on the national, but then that just creates all of these kind of methodological difficulties as researchers, and then pedagogical difficulties when we're teaching. So yeah, I think it's those workshops where we got to kind of share and debate and discuss different ways around those problems that were really productive. I mean, I guess another thing just to raise, because we touch on it a little bit in our article, are just some of the problems or the things that we think that we were struggling with. So like Austin mentions, like there's the kind of there's the UK problem of kind of UK scholars going to SCMS and then just hanging out with other people from the UK that they could have just got on a train to go and see 5 minutes. But then like that played into some of the scholars that we already knew, who we would then invite to be on the workshops and panels, who we would then end up being contributors to our roundtable. Like I was having a look, the kind of critical roundtable we put together with 10 different scholars reflecting on what is the transnational, how to use it in your work. Like our gender balance, it's fairly good, 6 female academics, 4 male academics. Our diversity of ethnicity and race, not so much. And the fact that 9 out of 10 of those scholars are based at UK universities suggests that actually, as much as we're building bridges and trying to kind of create this kind of inclusive network that brings people together, there were some ways that actually we were limited by our own personal contacts, people we knew, and that as much as we were trying to kind of inculcate that kind of broader network, it's inevitable that, yeah, a transnational SIG run by 2 British white guys is not going to be quite as kind of broad and diverse as the topic perhaps deserves. Yeah, Austin, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that was something we were we were very conscious of that from the beginning, I think, but it's kind of, as we looked in the process of writing this article, actually made us realize quite how perhaps we hadn't properly addressed it, even in our choice of panels like to sponsor. And because Iain and I are both scholars of kind of exploitation films, genre films, popular filmmaking, and we tended, I think it was unconscious, but we tended to select things that we wanted to go to when we are sponsoring panels, and you can see that in some of the names of the panels that we ended up sponsoring. So I don't think that's necessarily a terrible thing, because in some ways it does help to correct something in transnational film studies where it used to focus on kind of more respected forms of cinema, whereas actually it's a methodology that can be productively applied across all film history. But at the same time, were we creating the SIG in our own image? I think we were, inadvertently. So it was about time we handed it over by the time our 4-year tenure came to an end in 2017, and that's what we did. I'm not sure whether we should, if that's an appropriate note to finish on, or whether Iain's got more to say. But
No, that sounds good. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty more we could say, but maybe it's good to open to other comments and questions and contributions.
Mm.
Well, I guess I would say something really quickly. Just I found it interesting that you ended on this point of diversity, especially because I was like, hi, now there's Will and I, two white academics from the United States. But I just finished doing some of our sponsored panel work, and we're in the middle of doing our graduate student essay this year, and for the graduate student essay award. And one of the things that I've noticed is just there is actually a big shift in a lot of the work that we're getting submitted away from kind of US and Eurocentric transnational approaches. So that's been really interesting to me because I don't think that was the case when I first started doing this work. But I've really noticed a big shift in that. And I don't know if that speaks to the field more broadly, but it's definitely been visible in like the kinds of panels that people were putting forward for sponsorship, and just like reviewing the essays. I think only 2 or 3 of them are like really focused on like US, European topics.
Mm. Yeah, so I think that's good. That's good to hear, because it is the thing we struggled with most. I think was as Iain said, reaching out beyond the people we already knew and the people we were going to be talking to anyway. And I think our very first SIG event was at Chicago in 2013, and it was I think we kind of blew the $500 on champagne because every SIG got $500. We spent it all on champagne, and we just basically invited everyone we knew to come along and just go to a bar. And it was kind of we had a nice chat, and we did discuss the Transnational, but it was more of a social event, and it did because we didn't know how to do it really. But then as the conferences went on, it became more and more productive about actually what are we doing and why are we doing this. Though the $500 did still tend to get spent on alcohol, but.
Yeah, we often kind of weighed that up, like trying to work out what's the best way of making those connections and bringing people together. And sometimes the promise of, free champagne in the conference hotel is enough to kind of get people to say, actually, maybe I'll give that last set of panels a miss and just come to a social event. And people are often not lured in by the promise of a kind of tedious methodological debate over, well, how do we define the transnational? And is it a type of cinema, or is it really a type of methodology and perspective? And yeah, let's just spend the next hour going through that. It's more, okay, here's $500 worth of Prosecco. Let's go through it and everyone introduce themselves, say what you're working on, and let's get to know each other. And usually that would be a more productive way of kind of bringing everyone in and kind of, helping people make those connections, especially I think for graduate students who don't know other scholars, who haven't yet met the kind of the people that they're citing in their work. And that just helps kind of, build some of those connections.
Though it should be said that neither of us knew how to run a SIG. We just made it up. And I went to some other SIG meetings, and they were like boardrooms, and they were sitting around with an agenda. And I remember being quite shocked and thinking, I hope no one's worked out what we're doing. But it turned out that what we were doing was actually quite good. But it privileged a particular kind of socializing and networking that isn't necessarily applicable to everyone. So I think it's important to be a bit more inclusive than we perhaps were in the early days.
A couple of things I'd like to say. This is Will speaking. First, the wine and cheese and sociality really was what drew me to the group. I mean, I remember standing room only at your workshops, and a lot of energy. And I'm wondering if I could tease out a couple of concerns that I saw in your essay, in your article, and ask those of us who have been with the group, particularly on these sessions, these reading group sessions, if you think we have begun to address some of those concerns. One of them was, of course, the definition. We get past spending hours and hours trying to define the term. And maybe move on to more practical applications. A second is there was initially a fear that of ghettoization. Have we expanded to include other areas? And I think you you immediately saw that that was not a problem. If anything, it was getting too big. But there was also I think it was in Montreal, there was a workshop that focused on teaching, which Chelsea was part of. And there was an experiment with video essays in Atlanta. And throughout your essay, there's a continual reference to the political underpinnings of transnational scholarship. So I'm wondering if, Chelsea, you've been part of all of these, and many of you have logged in, starting with Sung-Hoon Jung's presentation in October, where he talked about world cinema in a global frame. And he's currently in South Korea. Rajinder Dudra, who is a Brit, I guess, but his focus was on Black British diaspora. And last month, Chris Berry, Brit again, but his focus was on China. If you think we have begun to address some of those concerns, and if not, what can we do to move in that direction? And that's open to really everyone.
Well, I would just say one of the things that we were talking about before we sort of officially started is the benefit of Zoom. I mean, we'd all probably rather be at the pub, but like this benefit of being able to bring everyone together without the expense and the exhaustion of travel. And I think that that's something, like thinking more broadly about the initiatives and the connections we can make beyond just the annual conference is something that I think is a really rich way to build on what Iain and Austin started with. Let's go drink a bunch of champagne in a room, which was excellent, except for you always planned it during my panels. So I only got to go like twice. But yes, I will not forget that. That was so hard. I always got those 6 p.m. panels. But I think I'm thinking about, yes, the reading group, but also the initiatives like the graduate student essay, which I take no credit for. That was started by one of our past graduate representatives. But these ways that we can build connections that don't rely on the people who have the ability and the funding to be at SCMS, the conference. And of course, we're still tied to SCMS, the organization, which is a whole other question, but like we've been working with BAFs more. Yael disappeared from my screen, maybe disappeared from this meeting. But we have been trying to kind of build that beyond just this sort of like, oh, there you are. Okay. It's like, you went away right when
I'm here.
Start talking about you. But
just
trying to build those connections beyond like, yeah, that sort of one event a year or those 5 days a year where we all maybe get to be in the same place, but maybe not. So I guess that's a starting thought too.
Yeah. Sorry, Iain, go.
I think from my perspective, I think that is definitely helping. Like I think having the reading group, making more use of the kind of online technology to bring people together, and just trying to find ways of making that format kind of as open and inclusive a discussion as possible, I think is important as well. Like I think, I think having a reading group, having the essay prize, so that it's not just the kind of, so that we can meet some of the aims that we had that initially around kind of building those bridges and getting away from kind of people talking separately in lots of different kind of national cinema contexts about the transnational, and to really kind of grapple with it, because when we're teaching kind of transnational perspectives on world cinema, that's something that scholars from a whole range of different kind of national cinema specialisms are grappling with. So I think you are moving in the right direction with both those initiatives. Austin, do you have?
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think there's also something very significant about this medium, about what might happen in the future as well, even when we are back to face-to-face conferences. Because in Denver last year, I was supposed to be addressing the Precarious Labour Organisation's town hall event, which was going to discuss things like remote participation for people who can't afford to come to the physical conference, and how to open up to a more diverse scholarship. That event is now happening, ironically, remotely. So, and it's happening in this forthcoming conference, and I'm going to be talking about the strikes in the UK as well as various other things. But so I think, as with so many areas of life, COVID is probably accelerating shifts that were coming. And maybe this is one of the very positive ones, that actually we could have a more inclusive discussion around what we mean when we try to kind of nurture a community of scholars. What does that mean? Does it just mean the people who can afford to go to the conference, who've got full-time positions and well-funded travel stipends, or does it mean everyone who wants to be a part of it?
I guess, I mean, one other little thing on that is it makes me think about the value of the transnational as a kind of perspective and a methodology. So it's not just about kind of making connections between people so that we all have more friends and we can be part of a kind of wider kind of academic community, but it's also about the challenges involved in doing transnational research. I think it's something that Sonia Livingston's talked about with kind of doing kind of cross-cultural media studies, but like often the problem with, like if we say cinema is a transnational medium and cinema is always kind of moving kind of transnationally in terms of its production, its reception, its exhibition, then how do we grapple with that? How do we write about it from a position of kind of knowledge and expertise? Because inevitably we're going to be limited by our kind of linguistic competencies, our kind of cultural knowledge. That's going to feed into what we write about. And so she kind of talks about the problem of, on the one hand, you can have scholars with that kind of deep level of kind of cultural knowledge, linguistic knowledge, and then in order to make it international, transnational, in terms of the perspectives, you just bring together lots of different people who are the area specialists, the national cinema specialists, to have a conversation in which they are the expert in their area, and they're speaking to someone. Here's this expert on Chinese cinema, and here's the expert on French cinema, and here's the expert on Japanese cinema, and we can all have a discussion about the transnational, and we can do an edited collection in which we each do a chapter. But inevitably, that's still lots of people who are separate and kind of, or there's the scholar who attempts to do the transnational work, but who inevitably is not, doesn't have that kind of granular kind of micro level knowledge of the different kind of national cinemas they're writing about. And so sometimes I think, yeah, part of the value of this SIG, or what we were trying to kind of aim for, was to help make those connections, was to kind of help, yeah, see if there is a way of kind of resolving that tension within the study of the transnational.
I see that Alan O'Leary has posted a question. Alan, do you have a more stable connection now? Would you like to speak for yourself, or shall we read it out? I guess that speaks for itself. Chelsea, my voice is
no, sorry, I can come in if you wish.
Yes, please.
Maybe I'll just, yeah, sorry, I can't put the camera on because just it freezes if I do. Maybe I'll just read what I put there. It's about the question of the definition of the transnational. And I guess my question really to all of you guys, both Austin and Iain and Chelsea and Will, is whether that's really gone away, I suppose, or have really been resolved. And the anecdote I used to stage the question here is this: I was once talking to Andrew Higson from York, who, as you know, wrote that article. Is it about the limiting imagination of the national? I don't remember the exact title now. And he told us this story of how he opened a collection on the transnational, hoping finally to understand what it meant, and found that the first essay in the book was written by himself. So, you know, there's this, this suggests, as I say there, that the definition remains elusive and still a concern, even though it's very persuasive what you report in the article. You know, you quote Will Higby, etc., talking about the transnational as being an approach rather than a quality in the work. I mean, that's very persuasive, of course. But we sort of can't get beyond it, I think, this definitional thing. And I can see why in your early years people would keep talking about it, because I think they're still talking about it. And I don't know if we should necessarily be ashamed of that. There's kind of, sometimes you just can't get beyond certain things, maybe.
I don't think we should be ashamed of it, and I don't think it will ever stop, and nor should it, because otherwise it would become monolithic with a particular agreed upon definition, which is never a healthy thing. I think the point really was that when we started doing this, it didn't go beyond those debates. It tended to just get bogged down in that, and that was as far as it went. What do we mean by this? And so, with what Deborah Shaw very kindly called the second phase of transnational studies, and talked about this SIG as ushering that in. I think it's more that yes, that is important, and it will always be, you know, theorizing key concepts is always something we need to do and will do, but it was more that we could do more than that as well. And so I think, yeah, you're right, we'll never stop discussing what we mean by it, and nor should we, because otherwise it just becomes yet another floating signifier that is useless. But I don't know if Iain agrees. But
well, no, yeah, I definitely agree that yeah, we'll always be having the discussion of what we mean by the transnational and trying to kind of grapple with the meaning. And I think that's the nature of the term. Like, I mean, I guess the two terms I tend to use most of my work is cult cinema and transnational, and both are kind of impossible to define, and from some perspectives are quite narrow concepts, and then from other perspectives could potentially describe all of cinema. Like, are there any films which are not transnational on some level? Are there any films that are not cult films on some level? And so I think, yeah, debates over definition, questions over definition are always going to come out of a term like the transnational, which isn't kind of fixed in that way. But yeah, I think often treating it as a perspective on cinema rather than as being a kind of quality of the films, from my perspective, has been a more productive way forward. And certainly in our workshops, we've always found that getting onto those questions of how are you researching transnational cinema? How are you teaching transnational cinema? What are the methodologies you're using? How are you building those networks? How are you deciding on your focus, your syllabi? What are the limitations that are kind of preventing the work from being more transnational? And those were often a bit more productive, rather than those kind of initial debates over, well, what do we even mean by this term? And it's partly that idea of lots of people feeling that it was just a trendy term. Like it was, oh, okay, so you used to work on world cinema, but that's a bit old hat. So let's just call it transnational cinema. And that'll all of a sudden seem really kind of new and up to date and fashionable. And so I think there was a lot of reaction against it initially. And lots of scholars who are even part of our kind of roundtable on transnational have that kind of reluctance to use the term, because they feel that it's just, you know, it's the new, I don't know, postmodernism, which at some point will be very fashionable and then will entirely go out of fashion and no one will ever talk about the transnational again. So yeah, I think academic fashion, I think, plays a role there as well.
Yeah, when you raised cult cinema, Iain, I was thinking, like, one of the other things you mentioned in your piece was that you both come from sort of this genre perspective, and everything you were saying, I was just like, well, isn't that like the same conversation we have whenever you get a bunch of genre people together to talk about something? And so I like that you addressed that, like, a lot of it is also that kind of suspicion of, like, is transnationalism like a trend? Because yeah, nobody questions that, like, Iain or Austin and I might have different definitions of the Western, you know, like that wouldn't seem weird, but you know, if we don't agree on the transnational, that's somehow more suspicious. So yeah, I think that's a good connection to what you were talking about.
That's a good
Alan,
point.
I don't know if you were at any any of the earlier sessions we've had, but Sung Hoon Jung had a lot to say about this. He used the term global framework, and which I found very helpful, and put that in a political perspective. There really is something different that he found in what is happening to cinema now that needs to be addressed. But just for curiosity, I did a global, I did a word search of the conference sessions for this year's SCMS, and I found transnational came up 36 times, global came up 26 times, world came up 42 times, and international 2 times. Those are the terms that seem most related. I don't know if that says anything, but I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking that that seems to say that the transnational is firmly established as a word. Whether it's established as a concept is more difficult to gauge, because we don't know the content of how that's being framed, I suppose, unless we go to all those panels. But also I wonder whether that balances up with panels that are very specific in their national or regional basis. And this is just one thing that kind of is coming out of this discussion as well about definition, but it's also about the political aspects of transnationalism, which is that I don't think it doesn't reject the national. I think that's one thing we always were at pains to end these workshops on, was that it's not a rejection of national context. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's acknowledging that cinema can register the transnational coordinates of a particular national context, and that actually gives us more insight into a national identity at particular points in history. In my example, post-war Italy, it's very hard to study that without thinking about the influence of the USA. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you're not really studying Italian national identity in that era. But you can name any countless examples of area studies where this kind of conceptual way into a particular historical moment just opens up a deeper understanding of a specificity is the word I'm looking for. Should probably stop talking.
I was going to make a similar point, Justin, because I think it's, for me, that works very well, that sort of just part of Will Higby's sort of understanding. It's an extension of the national, so instead of the national. I think some of the way in which a lot of the field at the beginning got muddled up in the fixation on a definition was that it was supposed to be a new approach to cinema, that cinema is no longer national, and it's, of course, it's not true. But it is a perspective, and I think that, at least in my mind, the difference between the global, the international, and the transnational is in the direction of the flow. You know, how the direction and the sort of reciprocity, I suppose, of the flow. Mm-hmm. And I think that transnational moment probably did respond to something that was when we started to see things coming the other direction. You know, we started to see things coming into Europe from, you know, China, from which were not, or India or others. So it wasn't that sort of global was associated very much at the beginning of that with that notion of cultural imperialism. And that has not been the case.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Because on the one level, I guess part of the urge for the focus on the transnational is to go against a kind of regressive idea of the kind of regressive nationalisms that by focusing on the transnational, you're by implication kind of invested in that more kind of cosmopolitan kind of openness to different cultures and cinemas. I mean, it's one of the debates that I've had with some. I try not to be too specific, British national cinema scholars who feel like if you're British, then your expertise is British cinema, And you, as a historian, you can write about British culture because you will have that cultural knowledge. For a British scholar to write about Japanese cinema or Indian cinema or cinemas from around the world, that is problematic, because you're never going to have the knowledge of someone from that country. You're never going to be able to write with that expertise. So we should kind of focus on what we can be experts on. But then the problem that comes out of that is that it plays into a fairly kind of regressive, conservative notion of national cultures, and that the transnational is a way to kind of move beyond that. But there's always, I think, as you imply, that there's always a politics involved with that. Like, is this, there was a kind of danger that was brought up at some of our early kind of SIG conversations around the transnational simply being a term of celebration, that it's just a kind of positive term. And so if Hollywood is making films that are transnational in the kind of global cultural imperialism way that you describe, then all of a sudden that becomes a good thing. And that's something to be celebrated in the same way that cinemas from around the world, if they are making a film that kind of reaches an international audience, as if there aren't any kind of, as if the power dynamics are not shaping the kind of relative politics of that. So yeah, I think being aware of those power dynamics, I think is, or for me, should be a part of the kind of transnational perspective, that it isn't just about a kind of celebration of anything that is transnational, in the same way that people talked about the problems in the post-colonial debates around hybridity. Cultural hybridity is something we should always celebrate. Well, yeah, that's not the case.
Can I ask a question that is very sort of focused, but from the perspective of taking on the BAFTA Transnational SIG coordination very recently? And it's really, you know, and I had a little chat with Austin about it once, about the kind of genesis of it in SCMC. And of course, I know BAFTA is much younger and sort of, but can you reflect a little bit more about the fact that it actually all those kind of discussions between British scholars were happening across the Atlantic, and you know, that BAFTA is very much still very British focused?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of exaggerating, obviously, for comic effect, because we were talking to other people, but there is a sense, and I mean, there are also environmental things to consider about flying the whole of British film studies over the Atlantic once a year to talk to each other. But it did start to seem like we were perhaps in our own comfort zones a bit too much, and that the need to meet new people from related methodologies and related disciplines could only really be met by a physical, or in this case, a virtual group. And I think that's the word is group, isn't it? It's from scholarly interest group. I think group is the most important word, and because those people would not otherwise meet, because everyone tends to flock to their own comfort zones at conferences when they feel a bit awkward and they don't know enough people in the lobby of the hotel. They look out for familiar people. And so that was just the single most important thing, I think, about this entire enterprise, was just meeting new people who could then discuss, just like we are right now. And I've just seen in the comment section that there are people raising other things about the definition of transnational and the political ramifications of it that perhaps wouldn't occur to us as European scholars, and that perhaps we're speaking from our own subjectivity even now while we're trying to critique doing that. And so I think that's precisely the benefit of this.
Austin, I'd like to just follow up on that, because Cecilia says she has to leave soon, and I'd hate to lose her without hearing the point she wants to make. So can I, Celia, are you there?
She said she's using the chat.
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Would you Hi, hello everybody. I'm sorry, it's a bit earlier here in Brazil, so I have a class this afternoon. But I just wanted to join briefly and say hello. I'm very happy to be part of this group. And yeah, I was just, you know, sort of, I've written a book about Chinese cinema. So I get that question asked a lot. Why are you writing about Judging Kerr or Chinese cinema? You're from Brazil and you studied in the UK. I mean, what do you, how can you, sort of write about Chinese cinema? And in a way, I've always been sort of a pupil or studied with Lucia Najib, from Reading. Now she's at Reading now. She was my film teacher here in Brazil when I was an undergrad. And Lucia did her PhD on Nagisa Oshima. And she was one of the first scholars here in Brazil who started studying other cinemas, because we have a long history in Brazil of only studying Brazilian cinema because we're sort of a new country. So we still have a lot of work to do in terms of coming to terms with our identity, our cinema, our history. So a lot of our scholars are dedicated to studying Brazil. But then Lucia was one of the first ones who in Brazil she did her master's on Werner Herzog and then a PhD on Nagisa Oshima. And then she went on to Leeds to work with the Center of World Cinema. So she's got this history in world cinemas. And so I kind of learned from Lucia, and I always felt that it would be okay for me to look into other cultures, and an outsider's view would also bring something new to, sort of a national cinema. And in terms of Chinese cinema, there's a lot of similarities with Brazil, and the experience of Judging Kerr cinema is sort of something that I, as a Brazilian, can relate to in ways that probably European people from North America cannot relate to as much, because there are similarities between Brazil and China. So I don't know. I mean, this is just to I'm sorry to speak about my own experience, but just to contribute a little bit to the debate and opening up to Latin America and these perspectives of Latin American and Asian cinemas that are not very, have not been explored, but hopefully this is something I hope to do in the future, sort of bring together these sort of transnational perspectives between what people call global south. It's a term I'm not very fond of. I wouldn't use it, but sort of south perspective. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. I just want to press you a little bit further, because a lot of people who would like to work in other areas that say they're not comfortable with the language or the culture. How have you been able to get past that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I've been learning Mandarin for 20 years. So This was something that I knew that I had to do. So, I mean, it does take a lot of effort. My PhD was on British cinema, and that was difficult. I did that in Birkbeck, at Birkbeck College with Laura Mulvey. And that was hard because, again, I'm in England, studying in London, but I'm from Brazil, and why should I be studying British cinema in English? So that was another sort of difficult thing for me to sort of overcome during my PhD. So what am I bringing to the PhD that is different from what a British scholar could bring? But so in regards to Chinese cinemas, it's even further away from me in a way. So, and the language is so difficult. So when I decided I wanted to do research on Chinese cinema, that was when I was starting my PhD. I started learning Mandarin. So that was 20 years ago. Of course, I'm not completely fluent, but I can get, I can sort of communicate and understand. I understand the films, and I traveled to China 20 times. So I'm always in China. I go to China a lot. So this is one way I found to kind of overcome this big barrier. Otherwise, I think it is difficult. I think the language is a barrier, and the language is something that if you are sort of going to be studying a different national cinema, that you will be sort of, yeah, I mean, I think learning the language is the first thing you have to do, even if you don't speak it perfectly, but you have to have some sort of knowledge of the language. Otherwise, it becomes too difficult. And this is one reason why I think in Brazil we have a lot of research on French cinema because of a tradition of learning French in academia. And in Brazil, we have this French tradition in film studies, especially. So we have a lot of scholars who speak French and study French cinema. But apart from that, also, of course, maybe American cinema because of English. But apart from that, it's really rare here in Brazil to have people studying other national cinemas. So, yeah.
I think this is a debate we've had in our workshops in the past, actually. This is ringing some bells. And I think I'm looking at Steve Rule here. I remember him talking about it, I think, about the outsider perspective and the fact that being an outsider can be a good thing, because you might miss some cultural nuances, but at the same time, you're coming at it from a completely fresh perspective without the kind of cultural training that someone from that country might bring to it, which can be actually very beneficial. Because you judge things as you find them rather than how you've been brought up to find them.
Yeah, I agree.
And I guess, I mean, for me, because this is always something I've been kind of, weighing up, I think it's always about self-reflection and trying to think through, well, what is it that I can bring? What perspective can I bring that will be kind of valuable and useful and interesting that perhaps another scholar can't? And because I think there is the danger, and I think it's, I mean, not to get into the kind of white male thing again, but there's a danger of kind of Anglophone academics who only speak English, who then say, well, I can just write about cinemas from any country in the world. They've got subtitles. Like, surely everyone wants to read my kind of great insights into this film, which I have no cultural knowledge of at all, but here's my great thoughts. And that because they're publishing in English, that those kind of, those thoughts become kind of read and kind of used, and people use that scholarship, often written from a kind of unreflective outsider's perspective. And that kind of isn't offered to scholars from other cultures. You don't have, like, so for example, often when you have PhD students coming to the UK to study, they're often encouraged, and the US, encouraged, write about your own national cinema. That's where you've got expertise, like you can do that. The kind of Anglophone scholar can write about films from around the world, but the kind of PhD students coming to the UK and US are often kind of slowly pushed towards, or at least that was the case. I know lots of PhD students who have had that experience. So I think your point there, Cecilia, is really, really useful as a way of like, well, no, there is a way to get beyond that, as long as we reflect on it and think about how do we get beyond those kind of limitations, because as you say, those perspectives can be hugely valuable, especially in the kind of south to south kind of studies.
Yeah, I was thinking that while a lot of the time I had, I was making connections with both Brazilian cinema and sometimes even with British cinema. So I could see some Judge and Cuss documentaries, and because I did my PhD, it was about post-war cinema and television. So I studied a lot of cinema gestures in Judge and Cuss contemporary documentaries, and I like these sort of interconnections between different national cinemas. I think interconnections are more interesting than differences. So, when you put yourself in that position where you're forced about something that is foreign, but then you will find connections, and that will be the most beautiful thing, I think, in terms of studies. Finding these connections and just echoes. I mean, they're not influences, not at all, but just hopes that appear and reappear in different times in world cinema or transnational cinema. Or Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Is there anyone else who hasn't had a chance to join the conversation yet? Please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in.
I was just thinking, because Austin kind of name checked me there. I think it was Chicago a million years ago. still feeling very comfortable as an outsider culturally. And I think Cecilia's kind of captured something there, that there's something about transnational cinema that captures these dialogues and these spaces in between. And the SIG kind of becomes another contact zone, doesn't it? As Mary Louise Pratt's term, that allows transnational studies somehow to remain in interstitial places, not quite fully grounded in national cultures, but somehow in between. And I'm wondering if that is something, because when I think of all the key works, they've all got plural categories. Deborah Shaw talking about 15 different categories, and Meta Hjort has 9, and then back to Appadurai and the different kind of cultural flows. So is transnational studies, or transnational cinema, or transnational screen studies, I guess, is kind of the control, and another pluralism to throw. Is it forever destined to be a pluralist approach? And if it is a pluralist approach, is that okay?
Who are you asking?
I'm asking you guys.
I think it is destined to always be that. And I think the last one you mentioned is screens, which is, I think we said at the end of this article that the definition of transnational was always the thing that everyone obsessed about, but actually now we're beginning to obsess about the other word, the cinema word, and that by definition, I think this kind of group, it has to be pluralistic, doesn't it? It has to be kind of constantly shifting and open to have its presuppositions challenged. And I think that the very fact that we are doing that to our own tenure in charge of the SIG is important. And I think the way to do that is through pluralistic thinking around the concepts. Again, I don't know if Iain agrees. We haven't discussed this.
Well, no, I definitely agree that, that part of the value is these conversations that we're having and thinking through what approaches we want to use. And that attempt at that point to kind of change the name of the SIG from Transnational Cinemas to Transnational Screens or Cinema and Media failed. There wasn't enough people who liked that idea. But then that is partly the kind of tensions between people who are like, well, no, I'm a transnational cinema scholar. I'm not media studies. I don't do kind of TV or other screens, so therefore they want to kind of keep it to themselves. Like this is our group. Like so there are often those kind of, I think, tensions around that more kind of pluralistic perspective in which you're saying, well, no, everyone can be part of this kind of larger kind of grouping, but then within that there are always those little kind of battles for distinction between different groups. And yeah, as you say, Chelsea, yeah, I mean, certainly I'm on team transnational screens, or given that SCMS has moved that way as well.
So it is interesting to note that SCS became SCMS in around 2000, was it? And then it took another 18 years for Cinema Journal to become JCMS. So this isn't an inexorable movement towards more inclusive definitions necessarily.
And I guess, just another little thing on that question of, work on transnationalism being kind of dialogic and inclusive and kind of, because I think, I mean, it was one of the things that was asked of me in the job interview for my current job was a scholar from French literature studies saying like, okay, so I'm a professor of French literature. I have always written about French literature. This is my area of specialism. I look at your CV, and actually you've written a little bit on Turkish cinema and a little bit on Indian cinema, and a little bit of Japanese cinema, a little bit on Italian cinema. Like, how do you do that? How do you justify that given the lack of cultural knowledge, the lack of, and I think reflecting on that and working through what possible things a scholar can do from that, kind of making those connections between different popular cinemas from around the world that might otherwise be missed. So identifying the ways in which kind of Indian popular cinema, when you've got the kind of the curry Western in the 70s, is building on various elements from specific Italian spaghetti Westerns, and having that knowledge of both forms in order to do that kind of close analysis of those kind of cultural borrowings and reworkings. That is a value of a transnational perspective. But then, yeah, I think that there are also things that that perspective can't do, that outsider perspective can't do. And I think often working towards greater cultural knowledge is part of the process of being a transnational scholar, like learning new languages, learning about other cultures, learning, like building your knowledge, and never claiming to be the kind of the great expert on the topic, that we're always forever learning, and that's part of the process of being a transnational scholar, at least for me.
I think that also underlines why this SIG was founded, which was not to celebrate the word transnational. It was to ask questions of it, exactly as we're doing right now. It was to consider what it means, whether it can be productive, how it can be productive, but not to, as we said, not to negate the national, not to claim that it's some kind of superior mode of methodology or analysis, more to ask questions of it and to be constantly self-critical about the way we use it and our own subjectivity as scholars as well. And I think it did succeed in doing that. I think we can say that, and the fact that we're having this conversation, I think, suggests that it did.
Steve, I don't know if this is what you meant by contact zones, but maybe it addresses the issue that the point that Cecilia was making about there's a value in not being an expert. I'm thinking of students that I have in my classes who are not born in the United States, for example, will show a Western, and somebody from Africa or from India will not know the genre in the same way, and they'll bring a perspective that will illuminate the films for the rest of us. Or I'm thinking of, let's say, what happened in France after World War II, when suddenly all these American films were dumped into the cinemas of Paris, and people like Truffaut and Godard began to see things in our films that we didn't see on our own. So I'd like to encourage. I think that's one of the advantages of trying a new language, trying to get out of your comfort zone. And maybe you can't write in depth about a cinema, but you can see things. For example, Chinese scholars have a whole different categories for film than we do, whole different ways of writing criticism than we do, that we've never considered. Give them a chance to apply those perspectives to our cinema, and we may learn something from that. I don't know if that speaks to anybody, but I know that several of you who are, particularly those of you who speak several languages, have had an experience like that.
I mean, Anne and Keiko brings up, yeah, the point of who is we within that conversation, because I think there is the kind of the danger always with the kind of transnational perspective of kind of people who are not experts, but being able to kind of talk about different cinemas, is that it's a position of privilege. I mean, it's a debate that Dina Yordnova is also kind of engaged in, because she's kind of advocated for the value of having the kind of like viewing across borders, viewing across cultures, that is a kind of valuable perspective in itself, and because it does kind of break down some of those kind of regressive kind of national perspectives. But I think there's also a danger of not acknowledging sometimes the kind of privilege of Anglophone scholars who can write about cinemas and not be an expert and justify that as being, well, I've got great insights and I want everyone to hear them. I mean, I know that like there were debates in kind of Chinese film studies in the 90s when you had like Anne Kaplan writing about kind of cross-cultural criticism and Chinese cinema and kind of writing from a position of not being an expert, and yet kind of reflecting on that and being self-aware. And I think Alan O'Leary's point about the kind of modesty of scholars who are kind of declaring their incomplete expertise is useful and helpful. And I think, yeah, Anne Kaplan's piece kind of thinks about, are there things that she can offer as a kind of feminist film scholar that she can bring to the analysis of Chang Yimou's kind of early work, for example. But yeah, being aware of the limitations of that approach as well, and kind of reflecting on that within our work. Because yeah, I think as Alan O'Leary says, the modesty of the kind of contributions to that special issue of Open Screens, I think is definitely important. Oh yeah, Veronica, did you have?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to contribute because I had a similar experience. I did my PhD on Chilean and US, mostly fiction cinema with some documentary and some other media artifacts as well. And I do speak Spanish, and I lived in Chile for a while, and I returned there for field work, etc. But I also had to, well, I also encountered some resistance to this idea of, you know, you as some white Western woman, I'm German, so, you know, why are you doing this, what, etc. I think there are issues like, as we've already said, like of broader power dynamics and situations in the world. And yeah, and I felt like I had to find my position for this, which, I mean, again, I think you've already mentioned this, and I kind of went back to Donna Haraway's idea of situated knowledges, and that we always come from a specific place and can offer something, and it always also comes with certain limitations, etc. And I actually have not yet been to SCMS, but I was very excited. Like I wanted to go to the last one, which was canceled. And so I just wanted to, you know, be there virtually for one of the 6 that I wanted to go to. So, hi.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, because I think that is a really, yeah, important part of it. The kind of the anxieties over your position as a scholar, the resistance that we sometimes encounter, and then trying to work through that and overcome it and think about, well, yeah, what value can my kind of perspective offer scholarship? Is there something that I can do that perhaps hasn't been addressed? And so, yeah, I think there's often a danger if scholars kind of use the kind of privilege of writing in English to be like, okay, well, I'm going to explain this national cinema to everyone else as the great expert. But sometimes it's the transnational connections that scholars have sometimes missed that is the kind of the great value of this work.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky position, definitely. But at the same time, I also thought it was somehow ironic because, as I said, I'm German and I wrote about US and Chilean cinema. Nobody ever questioned my right to talk about US cinema so far. So that was, I mean, I see why that is the case, but I just thought it is, yeah, it's a factor.
This reminds me of something Tim Bergfelder wrote quite famously and influentially about how all the national cinemas of the world tend to be seen to require linguistic specialism or cultural knowledge, unlike Hollywood, which is seen to be universal and anybody can understand it and study it, and that somehow privileges Hollywood and it centers it. And I think that's one of the things that we've always tried to get away from in this group. And I think And again, I think it with success, not because of what Iain and I do, but because of just the fact that so many people with different specialisms were in one room and collaborating. And I think Alan O'Leary made an interesting point on the chat as well about a key contribution a scholar can make to the study of cinema of another country is not to share the heritage approach to that country's cinema, because there may not be the same temptation to celebrate the supposed best. We're not constantly trying to celebrate that national identity if we don't have a stake in it, an emotional stake in it, our own subjectivity. So Anne's question, who is we, I think is probably the most important question of the entire session, and something we should always be asking, isn't it?
You know, I think the we is the human race in a way. We can't, that's, I think, incontrovertible. I mean, I've just been reading Elsesser's Face to Face with Hollywood, and he talks about how national cinemas, they come out of the international distribution networks that Hollywood created, right? And so this is a social phenomena that is global and that we're looking at with different specializations and different histories of knowledge. But I think we're all concerned with it as a global phenomenon, and it's just something that's just the reality. Like, we can't pretend that it isn't. Like, there might be movements towards national identity and, you know, looking at post-colonial ideologies and politics in the Philippines, where there are all sorts of interconnection between, you know, quote unquote American cinema and quote unquote Philippine cinema. And, you know, I think that's something that's probably motivating the this special interest group, right? We are looking at a global phenomenon. We are going to be limited in our knowledge and specialization, but we all are trying to figure out what it is, right? Perhaps in very different ways. And I don't think we really have to necessarily justify our interest in a cinema that's being produced in a different nation than the nation that we happen to be living in. I mean, that just seems to be an immediate limitation on the discourse actually of this phenomena, which is global.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and yeah, I mean, the point that Alan O'Leary is making as well around, like, yeah, there's value that can come from bringing out these different perspectives. So the problem of a kind of heritage approach, like like Dolores Tierney in her work on Latin American exploitation cinema, Latsploitation, she writes quite a lot about the problem that up till the point that book came out, there hadn't really been much work on kind of Latin American exploitation cinema. And part of that was that lots of kind of national cinema scholars were attempting to celebrate the kind of great works of Latin American cinema because of the power dynamics of film studies, of scholarship, of criticism. It's about drawing attention to these unacknowledged masterpieces of art cinema that perhaps haven't had as much attention. And therefore, inevitably, that means that you kind of don't write about some of the kind of popular kind of genre cinema, films that were influenced by Hollywood films that have sex and violence or other kind of exploitable elements, because that doesn't really help lend itself to the prestige of that national cinema. And there's often that tension around, like, yeah, kind of drawing attention to that work, which has been ignored and unacknowledged, is perhaps a value that can come from an outsider's perspective. But it's something I've often encountered where, on the one hand, again, the privilege of a white British scholar is when I've written on Turkish cinema or cinema of the Philippines, people have been saying, oh, wow, you're writing about Turkish cinema. What drew you to that? This is great that you're writing about it and you're interested in it. But on the other hand, I'm writing about kind of B movies, exploitation films, cult films, which don't really play into that same kind of prestige idea. I've also found that with cultural institutions as well, that if you want to put on an event with a kind of the Turkish Culture Institute or work with the kind of Indian ambassador, then your choice of films that you're going to be screening and the events you're going to be running, they have a very different agenda as to the kind of cross-cultural knowledge and the kind of transnational exchange that they want to be part of.
Yeah, real quick follow-up there. I don't know if you know Andrew Lavold in Australia. He founded the Trash Video store. So he's like the only guy who works on Philippine B movies, and he's Australian. And it's kind of like nobody in the Philippines wants to touch them. Nick De Ocampo, one of the major film scholars, Filipino film scholars, thanked Andrew for actually writing about Philippine B movies, you know, and that was just his thing, you know, this is his interest, his passion, I guess you might say. And he spent a lot of time traveling to the Philippines and looking at B movies, which weren't touched by Philippine film scholars, precisely because it didn't contribute to, I guess, you know, there was a tradition of practicing film scholarship and criticism as almost a hagiographic kind of exercise, you know, contributing to the construction of a national canon, if you will. That was a major motivation in film criticism, and you know, from the 70s, 80s up into the 90s, right? And so all that stuff was off the radar, but in fact, that was the stuff that actually constituted the bulk of cinematic production in the Philippines, in fact. So it's a big blind spot.
Yep. No, I think that's a great point. And I think it raises all of these issues around the power dynamics that we've all been kind of discussing. Yeah, like Andrew Leavold's a great example, like his documentary, The Search for Weng Weng, all about his kind of quest to understand the kind of 3 foot tall Filipino James Bond. Partly, like on the one hand, we can say, yeah, that's a kind of positive cosmopolitan embrace of another culture. He's traveling to the country over and over again. He's interviewing all the stars and directors, trying to understand. So there's that kind of transnational cross-cultural exchange and building of knowledge. But on the other hand, it's based on that kind of initial embrace of kind of low budget B movies from the Philippines as being kind of funny, kitsch, cult objects of humor. And that, yeah, the kind of politics of those processes and the power dynamics of those processes, I think are, yeah, it's important that we still kind of grapple with those.
Chelsea, I don't know how, Chelsea and Will, how much time have we got left? I'm just wondering.
We have 8 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
So if you have concluding remarks, now might be a good time.
Well, I was just going to respond to Roberta's comment in the chat, actually, because I think it's really interesting, where she says that as a non-Neapolitan Italian writing about Neapolitan cinema had to face the same questions that we're talking about, why we have chosen to write about other national cinemas, and that regional identity is as strong as national identity in this discussion. And I think that's really interesting, because the thing that unifies what we've been talking about and regional approaches is that they study the instability within national identities to varying extents and from various perspectives. And I think that's the most interesting thing for me, certainly, is that it's not about undermining the national, but it's about appreciating that the national is permanently unstable in various ways, and that can be through internal or external factors. So I think it's actually quite a nice flip side to what we've been talking about, and nicely marries with it, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's another question there from Anne saying, yeah, can transnational cinema studies embrace and cite as experts non-academic voices? So yeah, amateur archivists, autodidacts, fans, below the line screen laborers. And yeah, I mean, I agree. I definitely think, I mean, lots of my scholarship on kind of transnational cult cinema does rely on kind of non-academic expert voices. And I try and kind of both make use of that, like interviewing those people, kind of building the knowledge and building upon that knowledge and bringing it into academia, but then also reflecting on the power dynamics involved in that fandom. So the kind of what I've been working on is cult cosmopolitanism, so that you have amateur fans. I mean, Andrew Leavold that Daniel kind of brought up is a perfect example of that. Like he ran the Trash Video Store. He's kind of an obsessive cult cinema fan who's built up a huge archive of films. He is the kind of world leading expert on the kind of the B movies of the Philippines. But then there's all the questions that are raised by that form of kind of camp, cult kind of reception of a national cinema as an object of fun. Like, does that lead into something deeper and kind of over time? Like, is there the kind of initial cross-cultural engagement of like, what is this? I don't understand this. And then over time that kind of develops into something more substantial? Or is there a kind of problematic kind of exoticism underlying a lot of those kinds of fan engagements? So yeah, I think it is a kind of there's a kind of messy politics underpinning a lot of these kind of transnational processes.
There also kind of points to Barbara Klinger's arguments about multiplicities and kind of different ways into a text and different and equally valid readings of receiving particular films. And I think so yeah, I think I totally agree with what Iain's just said about the power dynamics at the heart of transnational fandom. But at the same time, it can lead to a more prestigious, or well, if not prestigious, maybe the wrong word, a more studied reception tale for a particular kind of film. Like in my case, I've just been writing recently about the Giallo, the Italian Giallo, and how it was received in the Western world, in the rather in the Anglophone world, as a kind of cult artifact, a transgressive horror subgenre, whereas in Italy it wasn't really a horror thing at all. It was more about mystery whodunits. But the way in which it's now survived in global popular culture is that it's become a phenomenon and with its own auteurs, and that's because of the transnational fandom of it. So I think it's certainly something that has to be studied because it's one available route into the text. So yeah.
And I guess linking back to that question of individual expertise, there's also the sense of like, I can't write about the cinema of the Philippines and be a great expert on the history of the Philippines and the kind of political tensions within the country and the cultural dynamics, because at a certain level I can't build that knowledge from sitting in the UK. But I can write about the transnational fandom of that, and I can provide insights into those processes from a relative level of expertise. And I think so sometimes it is about that questioning of yourself and what can I add, what perspective can I add that would be useful and valuable, and allows us to kind of interrogate all of the problems we've been discussing in a way that I can offer something new and kind of interesting and useful to other scholars, that isn't just about like, oh, I've learned something about the Turkish cinema and therefore I want to share it with everyone. And all the people who have written about Turkish cinema for decades are like, well, this is all obvious. What are you offering that's new? Well, no, I can say something about the way in which these films have circulated internationally and the fandom that has developed around them, because that's something that I do know about and can offer that to kind of broader kind of international scholarship.
I think that returns us to where we began, doesn't it? In terms of different national expertise, areas of expertise saying the same thing and not knowing they're saying the same thing, and kind of it's about dialogue between disciplines and fields.
And I think that dialogue was so beautifully modeled today. I was like, I'm gonna like try to wrap that up there, but yeah, and I think the encouragement to keep being reflexive on like, not just how we define the transnational, but our own practices within it and the work that we're doing is something I'm going to be thinking about taking away from this. So thank you, Austin and Iain, for coming back to the Transnational SIG to join us today. And I think this really sets up our next meeting, which will unfortunately not be stopped by $500 of SCMS sponsored libations. You will have to bring your own. It will be evening hour for those of you in the UK and elsewhere. So I hope we'll see you all there. That's March 5th. I don't have any Zoom links yet from SCMS. I don't know what's going on with that, but March 5th, 3 to 5 p.m. Central Time, which is a key difference to be aware of. And we will have a little bit of our meeting time, and then we'll also have our next reading group with Matt Holtmeyer. And I put a link to his reading. It is now way back in the chat, but I'll send it out in advance before that as well. So thank you everyone for coming. Thanks again, Austin and Iain. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you.